Welcome to the Future Series podcast, a podcast series powered by Benoy, the global family of design specialists committed to delivering world-class solutions for the built environment, serving as a thought leadership on all things related to design, architecture, real estate, retail, hospitality, and current topics of interest within the built environment realm, like data today. This episode delves into the growing importance of consumer insights in effective placemaking. We will explore the critical importance of understanding audience needs and behaviours when developing places, branding, destinations, and engaging with people. We're going to unravel the power of consumer understanding and shed a bit of light on the growing role of data in shaping meaningful experiences, developing successful destinations, and creating thriving communities. And here at Benoy's offices here in London, I'm joined by James Miller, who's joined Pragma as product director, and Kirsty Garrett, who's head of insight at the Crown Estate. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to cover a lot of ground in the next 30 to 40 minutes or so, principally around that topic of customer information and how it impacts on placemaking. First thing I think to point out to all our listeners, we're not going to rehash the whole debate around placemaking itself, but we are going to delve a little bit deeper into the use of data, aren't we? So, perhaps a little bit of background about each of you first. Kirsty, if you'd like to start, tell us a little bit about your role at the Crown Estate.
Sure. So I have spent 20 odd years working in insight for both banking and retail. And then a few years ago I was given the opportunity to join the Crown Estate, which was my sort of first entry into property and real estate. And it's been a fascinating process.
And that covers all aspects at the Crown Estate?
It does. So the Crown Estate it's quite a unique company. It was set up by an Act of Parliament, and we are an independent company that sort of straddles both private and public. The private means that we're commercially fit and we make some short-term commercial decisions, but we are not beholden to shareholders. Because we're not beholden to shareholders, that takes us into then the public. From the public, it means that we have sort of quite strong convening power, we've got good connections, we're good at bringing people together for the greater good of the country. And we also means HM Treasury is one of our key stakeholders. So over the past 10 years, we've returned 3.2 billion to HM Treasury. So we're very much a company for the country, and therefore we're constantly thinking about the data needs that help understand what are the requirements and the needs of the country.
And there's some wonderful flagship assets in that portfolio, so I think we're all quite envious of your job.
Yes, there are.
It must be very, very interesting, and I'm sure we'll come to bits and pieces during this conversation. And James, how's it been? You've joined Pragma a few months ago. Right. Tell us a little bit about your role.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dan. And 2 months in, so I'm still in some ways the new boy. But
fresh pair of eyes.
Yeah, let's call it that. My role at Pragma is one of the directors. So we've got a small team, small leadership team. We work on transformation projects, or property transformation projects around the world. So that's obviously a big part of what we do. My specific role actually is very focused on our proposition and our product and our strategy as Pragma, and how we work with the rest of our group of companies as part of Handley House, Benoy, for example. And a big part of my role is data analytics and looking after our capabilities on that side. My background, listening to the 20 odd years, Kirsty's saying, pretty similar vintage probably, and we've got quite a similar background, I think. I come from a retail background originally, a very commercial background around sort of marketing strategy particularly, but what's been part of my career throughout has been thinking about people, thinking about consumers, and using data around people to make better decisions. So I've been at various consultancies and startups and what have you, helping brands and organizations kind of harness their data assets, particularly around customers and consumers, so they make better decisions about their offers and so on. But I do have a very kind of heavy background in real estate as well. So I was the first head of data and insight at Into not so long ago, and in the intervening sort of years post-COVID, worked as a chief data officer and supported on a freelance basis. So I actually supported the Crown Estate and organisations like Landsec on kind of data strategies around real estate.
Interesting.
It's a real topic of interest.
Yeah. I mean, I think working within the world of data, but inside real estate, I mean, the real estate industry doesn't necessarily have the best reputation when it comes to utilising the best information and data, or, people describe it as a bit of an oil tanker when it comes to sort of moving and taking on new ideas. And that's really sort of setting the backdrop to our conversations today, because I know that we're going to cover things such as, deeper, much more granular, detailed information that's going to help inform real estate decisions. But I mean, I think going back to the days of, simple gravity models and acorn demographic analysis and those sort of things, which I think are now taken for granted. Is that something you agree with now? Or would you have anything to say against that so far?
No, completely. I mean, I think that the hygiene factors, so they are an important starting point, but they're very much the starting point. It's then about how do you move forward from that, and how do you bring the data to life. And I think both James and I, coming from a retail background, data is just built into your thinking. And part of the opportunity and challenge has been going into real estate, part of the Crown Estate, and trying to embed a sort of data culture and a data thought process. We're all doing it. I think data is part of our everyday lives, and when you make it much more accessible for people, that's when it then becomes much more natural in the decision.
Absolutely agree with you there. And I think with retail, data's always been important because decisions are made quickly, particularly around customers, and often in the moment. Particularly on websites or on digital side of things, and more so. What we found in real estate, and what I found, was that historically decisions took a long time. So leases were 10, 15, 20 years long. Those sort of cycle took a long time. So the kind of data that we were used to was that kind of more, as you mentioned, the gravity models, the fairly, I've been uncharitable, but some of the demographics that go off quite quick, they're quite old. So they don't really tell us an awful lot about people in here and now. But I think what's changed in real estate is the speed of decision making, particularly, and that's been unlocked by technology and changes in retail, particularly, and working patterns and so on. The lease, for example, which was the key piece that kept the length of time of decision making kind of stretched out, shortened and shortened and shortened. And we've had to become much more adaptable in how we kind of use assets and make faster decisions. So data's has come to the top of the agenda.
It's interesting, those gravity models and those planning and those future thinking kind of decisions were all based for those new projects that, there was obviously that enormous, that from a retail perspective, that shopping centre drive in the 90s and the noughties to develop. Now there seems to be this focus on standing assets and managing assets. Yeah. I mean, the use of data on a day-to-day basis to improve your existing asset is critical.
I think it's about understanding how a place breathes and lives, and the dynamic data demonstrates the dynamism of a place, and it helps you to understand, over the course of a day, over the course of a week, over the course of the year, who's there, why are they there, what do they do when they're there, and then, how do you keep bringing them back, which is also, how do you attract them in the first place, but then, importantly, how do you keep them coming back?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I mean, let's frame this conversation a little bit around, the customer and the consumer. What kind of trends are you seeing in terms of the way in which customers have changed, and the people who are using these places? I mean, James, you mentioned the pandemic, the small factor that's changed, that's pretty much that's pushed every single set of data out of, it's made it out of date, pretty much the next day. Yeah. So I mean, how have you had to respond?
Absolutely. I mean, I'll give you a view, and I'm sure from what you're seeing with your assets at Crown Estate, you'll have a really interesting view, particularly on the retail front. But I mean, obviously, the pandemic, we've almost started again in terms of our information. It's very difficult for us to go. As data people, we like to have trends, right? We like to go back in the past and predict forward. when you have an event like a global pandemic, we kind of start at 0 point from scratch. So, and what we have seen are very, very definite, very sudden trends, and typically they're kind of people trends. You could almost say we're almost glacial or generational in the way that they change. You know, technology's been running apace. You know, retail's been changing for the past 20 odd years now. You know, we keep talking about the rise of e-commerce, but that rose a long time ago. You know, it's something different now. But certainly we saw very, very quickly. I mean, the most obvious thing would be the working patterns and the change to people's lives, but in terms of where they are during a week. You know, the information that we work with our clients now, we definitely see, you know, that sort of Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday peak, Mondays and Fridays sort of falling away. That differs. Some places it's slightly different, but that kind of impact on people's working patterns had an enormous impact. Even, you know, we were talking with actually someone earlier today about workwear, and those shops are struggling in traditionally kind of working places, formal workwear. Yeah, absolutely. So these sort of have these impacts. So certainly on that front, and that, you know, that has an impact on a knock-on impact on retail. So, you know, and again, Kirsty could probably speak to this, but a lot of concerns around the retail economy in London, for example, or any major cities is having to adapt because people are behaving differently. You've got that going on. I don't want to get too political, but then you have the cost of living impacts and so on, which we're now coming through now very, very strongly and impacting the way people are behaving. And what we're seeing there, just as an aside, as a trend, there was a time that you would see sort of economic impacts affect certain groups, usually those that are more vulnerable to it. Now what you're actually seeing is that kind of affluent middle, who are usually unshakable in their behaviours, now changing. So, you know, they're shopping in different supermarkets. They're shopping at different times of the days of the week. They're splitting up the way that they buy groceries, for example. It's all changing very, very rapidly, and that's why this is why we need the data.
Yeah. And Kirsty, sort of pulling on your M&S experience, not just on buying work suits and shirts and blouses. What's been your experience over the last 3 years?
I think one of the biggest questions we had was actually from our workplace customers. So we talk about customers as people who rent space from us as such. And our workplace customers had to start earning the commute and start bringing people back in and giving people a reason to come back into the cities and come back into London in the instance that we're talking about. And again, it was about really helping to understand who else was there, how they were interacting, the shape of, you know, the nighttime economy completely changed. The importance of weekends changed. So it was really about understanding all of that data. And I think, you know, from my retail days, we just lived and breathed that data. You know, the minute you just went, you understood what people were doing, where they were doing it, how they were doing it, when they were doing it. Whereas, you know, we were certainly in the Crown Estate, we were starting from a bit more of a blank piece of paper and starting to understand that. So we've had to set up a lot of our data capability.
And from a workplace, the comment James made there about, you know, changing in work patterns, you know, the Crown Estate is one of the largest, if not the largest, office landlord in the West End, I believe. So have you been monitoring, you know, work days of the week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursdays, or are you Monday, Tuesday, Wednesdays?
No,
or are you Wednesday, Thursday, Fridays?
We're seeing the Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday. We're also seeing over the course of the day it's different, so the commute's spread. So we're seeing things busier at 7 o'clock in the morning, and it can spread into 7, 8 o'clock in the evening. We're also seeing that when people come in to the office and then working, what they're then doing is they want to make a day of it. And it does spread out into the evening. So we're finding that, you know, there's a benefit then to our retail customers or our hospitality customers in that, you know, people are there. So interestingly, spend levels have held up very well. It's just the shape and the pattern has changed. And again, just bringing it back to data, what's been important is for us then to be able to demonstrate that we understand the dynamics. We understand how things are changing, which then helps us to help our customers to engage their customers, because ultimately that's what we want to do within London and then across the country.
And just going back to that point about standing assets, asset management, the perfect flagship example of Regent Street and St James's and that neighbourhood, you're exploring new ways of opening up new side streets. You've got Quadrant Arcade,
Yep, we do.
other elements like that. How else are you evolving, or can you give us some insights into how you've changed that estate, or plans that you have to change that estate on the basis of good data?
Yeah, so I think it's about understanding where the trends are going and understanding how are people going to be living, working, in sort of entertaining in the next 10, 15 years. And that's always a challenge, because it is difficult to predict what the world will look like given the pace of change. But it's very much about sort of trying to get ahead of that curve in understanding. And again, I think it's about putting people back into it. At the end of the day, it is just human behaviour that we're trying to understand. So yes, the context changes, the growth of online or the growth of hybrid working, but actually the motivations of individuals remains the same. So it's about ensuring that, we always talk about putting people into the places, so it's about understanding.
Yeah, 100% agreed. It is all about the people. And we talk about consumer, but we're talking about people, really.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think we get lost in that. I think sometimes with consumer helps us almost say, it's not they're not human, but we go back and think about people, then we really start understand their motivations. And that's why I think a kind of actually a retailer mindset is really useful when coming into real estate, is because we're humans are the same. We're taught to think about the customer all day long. Like everything we're doing is focused on their requirements, and that means we need to understand understand their needs. And I was pondering this the other day, actually, because we talk a lot about human-centric design, and obviously we're part of a wider kind of architectural practice. But, and it's a term that's been around a long time, human-centric. But actually, I think the potential of human-centric design has been unlocked by data, because that's allowing us to provide the evidence for what people's needs, allows us to sort of actually put some data behind empathy. And as Kirsty says, put people into place, but in a way where we can actually substantiate that decision, make it clear about that. And it's a real mix of, I think, creativity and science, and art and science coming together.
And those changes in consumer behaviour that we've just been discussing, how is that feeding and impacting directly on those really those board meetings, to make those changes, whether it's Regent Street or if it's Rushden Lakes, what kind of give us some insights into that?
So I think from a Regent Street St James perspective, it's about ensuring, what's the role that we've got to play in making sure that London remains that global destination and that sort of, the iconic status that it has across the world. And Regent Street is a brilliant example of that. We sort of talk about the spine that runs through London. And it's obviously very beautiful as well, which helps.
Looks fabulous in the coronation.
It looks fabulous.
Yeah.
It did look fabulous. The flags are incredible. But again, the flags are a really good example. And the Christmas lights, people come to see the place and to experience the place. So sort of great examples of, as making it a destination. I think in terms of the discussions, it's always about, are we developing the right products for the future? And the products for us in the future are, do we have, people are moving more to, serviced offices, people are moving away from, actually they're moving to, there's a real flight to quality in workplace, because the motivation is to get the employees back in. It's very much a reflection of your brand identity, your corporate identity. So, it's about how we enable, or how me and the team enable the business to really understand what our customers are looking for, and therefore, what their customers are looking for.
It keeps things relevant.
It keeps things current. And, I absolutely love retail. Because of its fast-paced, and it really is. You live and breathe almost by the season ahead of you. So, one of my challenges coming into real estate was this ability to think and predict into the 5, 10, 15 years down the line. And, and then you shape the products and the services and the leases. James talked earlier about, the move to short-term leases. And, there's 15-year leases do still exist, but there's definitely a demand for shorter, faster, because the world's changing. We're in an incredibly volatile world, and data is just another way of helping us to navigate that.
Yeah, absolutely. So
is that unique to the UK, James, or is it any other experiences outside?
No, it's the world over, really. I think what we found with data in general, I'd say the US and the UK have always been sort of quite forward with this kind of mindset, I suppose. But no, our work is right across the world. It's exactly the same. So for example, sort of tracking consumer behaviour, not in a bad way, in a sort of sinister way, but that kind of anonymised way of understanding movements of people around spaces. Is something that's available in lots of different geographies now, lots of different countries. It's being used as a way to actually understand, well, the best thing we can do really is bring the assets to the people. And we need to understand where these people are, how they're behaving, and so on. So, yeah, absolutely finding that approach is becoming more more common around the world, which is great. I think in some ways it's developed more so here because of the maturity of real estate in general. Retail's
attitudes to real estate, do you think?
Yeah, and attitudes are changing to real estate, I think, over here. So when I first, I mentioned it, I was a surveyor very early on in my life, and a sort of a data-driven one, and I found that hard early in my career because no one was listening. So attitudes have changed, and I think adaptability has become a byword in everything we're doing, and as Kirsty mentioned, things, the macroeconomic environment, politics, whatever, has changing rapidly, and that is very much the new normal, is change. And I think we're realising that we do spend a lot of money on building spaces, but we need to do it in such a way that's adaptable to the needs of people. And I think the adaptability comes in, and I think that's where the data plays in again, and making sure that we're not looking at a gravity model that we updated 5 years ago, or demographics based on a 10-year-old census, for example. We're actually looking at what's happening now.
Yeah. It's about, would you say it's about enriching people's lives? In terms of, you mentioned about the humanity element. Yeah. In terms of people are they're working, they're either working, they're shopping, they're relaxing, meeting friends. Yeah. How can we use data to help enrich people's lives?
It's about being relevant to people's lives, and and being present in their lives. There's very, very few occasions where you will go to a place for the place. You actually go for the experience. And and that's whether you're working or living or sort of shopping, entertainment, etc. So I think making a place relevant to the individual, which then is about providing a connection, it's giving them a sense of belonging, and the belonging can be temporary, it can be a fleeting moment, or it can be somewhere where you want to keep visiting again and again, because there's a draw, there's a magnet that sort of pulls you in.
Yeah, and I would say that's again one of the big trends. It is experience, and it's something that people are looking for, and that comes out everything that you're doing now. Lots of places need to be functional as well, because people need to go and do stuff. But the experience side, in terms of making places different, giving people the wow factor, that kind of surprise around spaces. My tenure at shopping centres before, things obviously got very difficult due to COVID in that sector. But everything's focused upon how we activate spaces. How do we create more of an experience? How do we enliven these places? And people respond positively to that, because it's humanity. It's enjoyment.
But speaking to two data people, how do you measure experience?
Always a challenge. We do have metrics in place, and sometimes it is about just grounding it in some of the KPIs and the facts, and putting benchmarks in place, and measuring movements from a point in time. So I'm sure everybody is still comparing and contrasting back to pre-pandemic. If I take just London as an example, international tourists, understanding international visitors, where they're coming from, when they come, whether the pattern of them, whether vacations have been extended, shortened, etc. So, I think that becomes, critical to just understanding. And I think people instinctively felt that they knew what was going on. I think the pandemic has changed that, where you really need to use data to start understanding. And those metrics, now, we have, if we're renting out a space, there is an expectation that we know who's coming, how many are coming, how long they spend there, what they spend, what they're looking for when they get there, and then whether or not they've walked away happy. All of these become the kind of KPI metrics that the business regularly looks at, and we're evaluating the success of a place.
James mentioned that the data capture, not the creepy side of data capture, but how else are you monitoring that and measuring the softer side to experiences and happiness when you visited a place?
We very often go out and talk to people, which and I think big data led to talking to people to going a little bit out of fashion, because it was, you don't need to talk to them, you can just monitor what they're doing. But actually that tells you what they're doing, not why they're doing it. So going out and really understanding and, blending the sort of factual data then with the softer side's important. And, an example of that, we're currently looking at the Haymarket district, and we could see that within the retail, the retail footprint, we should have been drawing in people from North Westminster. We weren't, so we went out and spoke to the North Westminster residents to say, what stops you coming down to this area, and what would you want when you come there? What would be the draw that would bring you in? And I guess what are the barriers that stop you coming? And that was hugely insightful. In people have to get 2 buses to get there. I mean, some of it can just be practical, and some of it can be, it feels a bit touristy once I'm there. So again, it's this constant, and when you've got big places that draw a huge number of people in, it is a constant balancing act. You mentioned Rushden Lakes earlier, and Rushden Lakes, 25% of the people who go to Rushden Lakes just go to walk around the lakes. They actually don't go into the shops. They don't eat, drink, etc., enjoy the leisure facilities. So, for us to understand the draw and the importance of the lakes was hugely important in ensuring that the car parking was set up for it. So you do immediately take it into all the functional benefits and the functionality of it. But it's about understanding the motivations of why people went in the first place.
Absolutely. And I 100% agree. And it's becoming, in recent times, very focused around motivation and mindset. Those words are key, but around people. Kirsty mentioned, and with the way I kind of look at it is that we can tell a lot about people from their behaviour, from the stuff they don't tell us, right? So the way they move through a place, how often they go there, how often they dwell there, something about their demographics, because you can get that information and what have you. But it's only so much. That's kind of the base, and as Kirsty mentioned, you have to go and talk to people. And we're talking data. We're not, data for us is not just numbers. It's information. It's insight. And talking to people tells us a lot. And we do a lot of this. So we kind of have our quantitative information, which we'll get from lots of different sources. And a nerd like me, I'm in like heaven these days with the amount of stuff I can get hold of. It's brilliant. But that said, any project that we engage with will have that quantitative side, but we will then go and talk to consumers, people. We'll talk to people that either are already visiting something or doing something, or potentially could be consumers of a new development, for example. And we start to get to the bottom of their attitudes and what have you. And you sometimes don't need to ask lots of people that question. So it's not big data at all. You speak to the right people, you get enough of a flavour to really kind of drive those decisions. And that's the difference. And we're back to the earlier in the conversation, we talked about, gravity models and demographics. That's the base that kind of gets us to a point, but all of that richness, those flavours, we have to go out and talk to people.
Have you seen any changes to the way data's captured, or are you expecting any changes to the way data's captured?
I mean, very much so. I mean, I guess invisible data. So, from the perspective of we don't need to ask you what you're doing. We are able to monitor it as an industry. So, we can see what your spend patterns are. We can see what your visitation patterns are. Anonymously, obviously all within GD.
Absolutely.
Compliant and the rest. But it gives you that understanding. So you don't get claimed behaviour. Claimed behaviour was, in the early days of my career, people either massively overestimated the amount of time or money that they spent on something, or they underestimated it. And therefore you were always trying to, navigate through to the truth. Whereas, data allows you to monitor whether it's what you do on your card, what you do on your phone, your spend patterns, your visitation patterns, etc. We've all got loyalty apps. All of these things are ways of us understanding, the behaviour of what you're doing, and then, as James said, you then overlay on top of that the quality. I mean, I very rarely call myself a data person. I'm very much an insight person, and because data is just stuff. So how do you make sense of it as well? How do you, and that's about making sure you're asking the right questions of it, but also that you're interpreting it in the right way, and then you're applying it. I mean, we always talk about the what, so what, now what, and the impatience of the business, and every business now is that let's get straight to the now what, but let's make sure it's based on evidence.
Can I cover also now something around sort of the offline data? Online data, beg your pardon, that's sort of overlaid with the offline data, because I think, people movement, spending patterns, those types of, reason for visit, those types of things are often driven by online information or online behaviours. Are you sort of overlaying that?
Yeah, very much so. And, if I talk about my retail days, so, we used to talk about multi-channel, then we started talking about omni-channel, and then we've stopped talking about that, and it's actually just about touch points. So people want to interact with a brand wherever they are. So whether that's sitting in their bed on a Sunday night when the kids have gone to bed, or whether that's their lunchtime or the bus, or whether it's that they want to go in and spend time in a store and engage. So understanding how those worlds collide is really important. And I think, if we take more and more retail is moving into experiential. So very often they won't actually sell something from the store. It's very much about how do you experience that brand. And, one of the things we've been talking about is, how do we view our footfall as the equivalent of cost per view? It's about sets of eyes on a brand, and it's advertising in a different form. It's a media channel as much as anything. And then also there's you're talking about an engagement with a brand that becomes hugely important. How does that brand come to life for the individual? So yes, very often that's in a physical place that then supported by an online purchase or an online, and that has got implications, because implications for space in terms of stock availability, stock storage, how you're going to serve these purchases. People expect to be able to get home by the time, they might buy something in St. James, and by the time they get home, they expect it to be delivered. It's that interaction. So, that seamless process puts a lot of pressure on us all. And again, data is hugely important in driving that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is hugely important. I mean, that's the world I come from, particularly is probably what are called omni-channel, but I tend to agree with you, because people don't wake up and go, I'm an omni-channel person. They expect convenience. It's driven by convenience. and they know the technology will allow for that. It places a big pressure on organisations to start to join up the dots, and that's where the data comes in, and that's where a lot of the effort and the investment has gone in companies that kind of looking, this is all the back end stuff. This is the mechanics about where do they get the data from, how do we link it together, how do we integrate it, because that's the way we're going to understand the journey someone takes with us, so we can do the old marketing tricks of, reach that person at the right time, the right message, in the right place, and it's quite a challenge for in the real estate world, in the sense it's been very physical for a long time. But some of the, there's quite a lot of interesting work going on there that we're seeing, where organisations start to bring the data together. And as an aside, one of the things that I think is really fascinating, and it's been going on for a number of years now, and it seems to be escalating more, is the pure players, we used to call them, but the digital operators, taking physical space for short periods of time sometimes, so they can get in front of people. No expectation of a sale within that shop, but they can get there, and it's about brand awareness, and it's about kind of closing the journey a little bit. And that's fascinating, and I think that's a boon for physical space and operators, but it's about getting their heads around the business model and how that all works.
It's very often about the social impact that they're having as well. So, we've had things like Green Planet, we had Google with their launch, taking pop-up spaces with us, and we recently introduced Gymshark.
Yeah.
And it was the first physical space that they had, and it was very much about what's the social impact that they want to have on local communities in multiple different ways.
Is it the place for the landlord to have that relationship with the consumer, or do you think it is about the brands?
I think it's both. I mean, ultimately people are engaging with the brands from a retail perspective, but I think the landlord's job is to make sure they're setting the right scene, they're setting the context that the brands can succeed. Yeah. And, we often talk about, serving up the right end user or serving up the right customer. So, we've got a responsibility to be bringing in the right people, and bringing people in full stop, but then also bringing in the right people, and that they come with a clear expectation of what's there as well.
I agree with that. I agree with that. And I mean, I'm going back to my shopping centre days. We did see it as our job to have to create as close a relationship with what we used to call the visitor as with our customers who were tenants, because that meant that, one, we could have a better conversation with our tenants, and our job was to, as Chris said, was to kind of serve them up, bring people in, give people a reason to come to a space. And I think there's always an expectation, particularly on sort of commercial customers, that landlords particularly do that, and that just requires understanding people again. It's a data problem.
It's also not just about cities and shopping centres and retail, etc. And so the Crown Estate owns the seabed of England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and we are doing a lot of work about understanding coastal communities. So understanding the impact of, by having, as an example, offshore wind, how do the coastal communities engage with that? And, we talk about data being relatively new to real estate. It's not been quite at the fingertips as other industries. The seabed's obviously invisible to most people. So we have an incredible data lake of, we call it the Marine Data Exchange, which is incredible in understanding the birds, the fish, the tides, everything, and that's because it all happens underneath, so that it's invisible, and therefore data had to be used to really understand and to make sure that we were doing the right thing, in terms of evolution of offshore wind and the other industries that are dependent on the seabed. And that's been really useful for me in the Crown Estate, because there was an ethos and a thinking process which was, well, we need data to understand what we can instinctively get to, therefore, in the pandemic changing things where, empty streets don't look good. So how do you bring people back in? How do you make the invisible, visible to people.
Yeah. And then just the last point I wanted to cover off, just thinking about, this idea of a data revolution, and if you pardon the pun with the marine, the marine estate, just thinking about, a sort of a real sea change in our approach to utilising data. But, what about artificial intelligence and AI, artificial intelligence, and thinking about how we're using it? It's in the media, front and centre right now. Are we applying it towards real estate?
Well, I'll pick up a little bit. It's getting there. It's starting. I mean, my background does involve a fair amount of AI because it's particularly applied to marketing, retail websites and so on. I've been using machine learning for years to, for example, serve up personalised offers. So they kind of take the signals of people and send them an offer, and it's a machine doing that. And often it's AI that makes that decision of whether you're going to get 10% off or 20% off. And that's been going on for donkey's years. Real estate is interesting, and I think there's enormous potential in different places with real estate. There's certainly potential there in terms of the consumer and customer information. And an example I actually saw during the pandemic was when we had social distance. So in enclosed spaces, there was actually a need to let the machines work out, are people getting too close to one another? And those sort of flows of data you get out from use Wi-Fi data, for example, to drive that. There were early forays in actually a few years ago in real estate to kind of use AI to actually see if we make decisions faster than a security guard on a door could make effectively. It's all about balancing investment. Sometimes it's better just to pay the security guard to do it than spend millions of pounds on some kit. But where I'm seeing it as well is certainly things in terms of building maintenance, things like predictive maintenance and so on. I think it's got a very important play in terms of sustainability of buildings. Yeah. So, making some of those decisions quite quickly about do we switch the air conditioning off or on, or put the temperature up or down. AI can do that, and as already is in some cases. And then I think on the design side, I've got to mention, architecture. AI is already playing a role in terms of conceptual design and so on, and getting people faster to the point of coming up with real design, doing that conceptual work. So real estate in general, I think there's great applications for it. I think there's still work to do at the sort of board level to really understand what the use cases are for it. But it's coming, it's here, there's no two ways about it. But,
and again, I mean, it's the practical, you make it operational. So, I mean, using toilets as an example, but, toilets historically were cleaned X number of times across the course of the day. And, there's now systems in place that you go, right, well, actually after every X use, we'll clean. Similarly, there's AI built into planting. Which is about, are we using the right water levels? Are we, one, which is good for the plants, but also, so that we're part of sustainability net zero agenda, that we're not overusing nature's resources. And again, I think it's about not making AI as a productionized, this is what you do, which works very well, I think, for factory production, commodity products, but moving beyond that into actually just helping things run better, helping us to understand, how people are using different parts of transport. All those things is where AI
Are you using AI
comes in.
to predict other trends, though, to overlay multiple data sets? Or, I think the idea of the served up offer, on a website, James, or the bathroom cleaning schedule, we can understand that quite quickly. But are you overlaying multiple data sets to reveal any trends?
I think the best insight always comes from integrated data sources. So moving from one to the other, it's when you put it all together that the magic happens as such. And that's where machine learning comes in. I mean, that's a form of AI, and the machine does it much better than any of us as individuals, its capacity. So I think throwing a whole load of data into a data platform and then using machine learning to really understand how an area or a location or even a space, it can be an individual space, Or my example of the seabed. How does the seabed operate? That's all done through machine learning. That's all AI. Because it's about understanding how everything interacts with each other.
Absolutely, Kirsty. And you write down, it is the power of AI is to make connections that individuals are unlikely to make. So there's a one particular organisation does a lot of residential data, investment data, and they're using AI to find out things that that car ownership or Airbnb presence in a certain town has an impact on residential prices. Now, there's stuff that analysts haven't found out; the machines have done it. So it's a very useful productivity tool. And the other area I'd add as well is that most real estate organisations I know have got sitting on a lot of knowledge. But it's not normally in data in the sense of numbers. It's information, it's leases, it's documents, legal documents, all sorts of stuff. There's massive potential, and this is again for generative AI and large language models, to be applied to this so people can actually find stuff and make connections. That's an enormous benefit, just for real estate organisations in general.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And then lastly, the final question, it would be remiss of me not to ask each of you what your favourite destination and place is. James, do you want to shoot with yours and why, obviously?
Yeah, mine is, so it's not a design-based place as such. Mine's the city of Edinburgh. And the reason I've got fond memories because I lived there for quite a while. So that I am slightly biased in that front. And despite my accent, I come from a Scottish background as well, so I'm being a bit partisan. But Edinburgh for me is sort of a true example of a livable city, which we don't necessarily quite see in the rest of the country. And for me, I think it's the mixture of the levels of the city, it's the heritage and the blend of the old and the new, and the way that the new has been blended in, particularly. And the public realms for me is very strong in Edinburgh, and certainly in the centre. It's a very walkable place. You're not going to get in a car and go anywhere particularly. You'll get on a bike, you'll walk. There's things around corners and so on. And that's a testament of its organic growth as a historical place. But I think generally in terms of the new developments, some less so, but some new ones have done a really good job at kind of integrating themselves into that pattern that people were used to in that city. So that's always been my favourite.
Yeah, no, big changes in Edinburgh with St James opening quite recently. Kirsty, where's your favourite place? I think I might have an idea.
Well, being Scottish, I'm not going to say Edinburgh because I'm from the other side of Glasgow. But I love London, and I love London because it's a real melting pot of people, places, buildings, public realm, all the things. I've never used the word public realm until I moved into real estate, but making it feel, and the bit you're hinting at, I do love Regent Street. I particularly very early in the morning, so if you're heading into the office at 7 in the morning or late at night, and I've never been one that's particularly into architecture and design, but actually I really was able to appreciate how buildings can live and breathe. And, there was a real sense of energy and momentum, which I hadn't experienced before. And I'd lived in London for 20 odd years, but actually it was going early and late that really sort of brought that to life for me. So, and actually the more you look up, the more beautiful Regent Street becomes. When it's busy, you tend to be looking ahead of you where you're going, but actually being able to step back and just look down and then see, what's often very beautiful at the top of the buildings. And it always gives me slight shivers. So, and then you get the sense of pride that it's the Crown Estate. You're part of this, and you're part of making it great, which is then part of making London great as well.
Wonderful. Kirsty Garrett, James Miller, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Future Series podcast. We hope you enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.